Okay, so in this section we are trying to find the domain and range graphically. So looking at a graph that would show us the domain and range. So let's make sure we have the definition again in our notes. Okay, so let's write down the domain. So the domain, okay, is the set of all x values that correspond to points on the graph. Okay, so let's write that. It is the set of all x values, right, that correspond to points on the graph. Okay, and then of course the range is the set of y values because the set of y values that correspond to points on the graph. So these are the two definitions that we need to put into our setup. And I'm sorry again about my handwriting, but still I don't know how to improve my handwriting. I keep practicing, but writing on a pad is pretty difficult. I'm still having issues with it. So let's take a look at an example that is in your study guide. So here is a particular problem that's in your study guide, and it says down here the domain of the function. So it wants to know what is your smallest value that is in this graph that's an x value for the domain, and what's the largest. So if you look at the actual graph, you can see it now. That domain is all the x values. So it starts here at -9, not -10, but -9. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put in -9. So -9. And then because I'm finding domain, I'm going to pick the x. Okay, and then it doesn't get any higher than +9 on the x, so I type in a 9. Okay, and so then I can check to see if I did it right. Yep, I got it right. And then it's going to ask me to do the range. So the range is the lowest to the highest of the y values. So I'll pick 0 because it doesn't get any lower than 0 because it starts here. Okay, and y value at this point is 0. Then I pick y, and then it doesn't get any higher than, looks like 1, 2. So 2. So I put in a 2. Doesn't get any higher than 2. So those are the y values. Remember, when you're thinking about range, it's the direction of the up and down. When you're talking about domain, it's left and right. What's the smallest left? What's the smallest right? Okay, we check that, and it says I got it right. So it says it can take you on to the next problem. Okay, so let's take a look at another problem. Okay, it says use the graph of the function to identify the domain and range. So I can see for the domain that right here is -0.5. Okay, and it goes all the way up to 0.5 for the x domain. So that looks like this one here. Okay, I can check my answer. That's right. And now it wants to know what it is for the y. Well, the y, the lowest for the y on this curve is -2, and it doesn't get any higher than 2, so it has to be this one here. Okay, and so that does it. Okay, so here's our two examples that we did. Okay, so we could do another one. What is the domain of f of x? Well, I have to look at the curve. Let's blow it up so we can see it better. Okay, so I see, you can hear my dog. He says, I want to play. Sorry, go lay down. Go lay down, Harry. So my lowest one is -1 for x. So that looks like this one and this one. But then it stops right here at 7. So it has to be a. Okay? Alright. And the same thing, I'm going to find the range, which is the up and down direction. So the lowest is 5. So here's 5, and this one's 5. But it stops at 9, it looks like. So I'm going to pick A for that one. Okay? And so this is typically how you do these particular problems. Sometimes, like on your mastery test, it's going to come up. I'm not going to want it in an inequality writing. I'm going to want it as an interval notation. So looking back at these problems, like I'll go back to this one. Okay, and I think it doesn't save these problems, just, yeah. So if I look at this problem, I got this one right, okay, I can see that I picked these settings. Okay, so for the x it was 1 to 9, so I would write it as an interval notation of interval 1 comma to 9. Oops, let's do that better. Okay. So this will be my domain. Okay. And then for my range, let's go back to the picture so we can see it again. Okay. For the range, it looks like it's at 4 to 8. So I go back down here and I can write for the range is 4 to 8. Okay, so this is how we write it as an interval notation, and that's what you'll have to do for a future mastery test that's coming up. Okay, so let's take a look at another one. Let's see here, just so we have a couple of them in our notes. Okay, let's say we look at, I'll go back to another problem because it keeps changing them. Okay, so this one again is at -1 to 1. So my domain would be -1 to 1. So to do that, I would come down here, I would write domain is -1 to 1. Okay, writing the other way is more difficult, I guess, for me. Alright, and then for the range of that particular problem, if I wanted to do that, that goes as low as -4 and no higher than 4. So that's my range. So I write bracket -4 comma 4 bracket. The only time that I would have a parentheses instead of a bracket, and I don't see any problems like that in this. I'm scanning through these problems. Oh, like this one does. So let's do this one as an interval notation and an inequality. So for domain, looks like it, if we go and zoom in, and it's better, looks like it's at -4. I'm sorry, for the range, it looks like these arrows go on forever. And so that means I need all of the x in this direction and all the x in this direction to do that. So to do that as a domain, or as a domain, or as an interval notation, I would write parentheses -infinity to infinity. Okay, that's my domain. If I wrote it as an inequality, it would be -infinity less than or equal to x less than or equal to +infinity. Or I could just say all reals. But on a mastery test, this is what you'll actually respond as. And then if I'm going to look at the range, let's go back to the picture again. Looks like it's low. The lowest is at -5, but it keeps going on because of these arrows. So I'm going to need all the y values. It doesn't stop. So that means for this one, I would write bracket negative. Oh shoot, I don't remember that number now. I got to go back and look at it. So yeah, -5. So -5. And then it would go on forever. So there's my parentheses. If I did it as an inequality, it would be -5 less than or equal to y less than or equal to infinity. Okay, because it's going to go all the way, going to keep going. And then I couldn't write it as all reals because it stops at -5. Okay? And so these are the typical ways that you would have to write the domain and range when you're looking at graphs.